Part 1. The legends of Blackwood Forest had circulated in town for years. People spoke of strange lights dancing between the trees, whispers in the dark, and shadows that moved with a life of their own. Most people avoided the forest after sundown, but for Lily and Matt, the forest was the ultimate test of bravery, a challenge they couldn't resist. Lily had always been the adventurous one. She was fascinated by ghost stories, mysteries, and anything that hinted at the supernatural. Matt, her best friend since childhood, was more skeptical. He didn't buy into paranormal tales, but enjoyed Lily's excitement and knew she'd never go alone. Together, they made the perfect team, their courage and curiosity balanced by each other's company. One chilly autumn evening, they decided to finally face Blackwood Forest. Armed with flashlights, snacks, and a vague plan to reach the heart of the woods, they set off as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine hung heavy, mingling with the earthy scent of decaying leaves. They walked side by side, bantering to keep their nerves steady. "This is such a bad idea," Matt muttered, glancing around at the shadows that stretched and twisted with every step. "Oh, come on. Where's your sense of adventure?" Lily teased, nudging him with her elbow. "We'll be fine. Just stick close." They continued down the narrow path, flashlights casting beams over twisted roots and the skeletal branches reaching out like claws. The deeper they went, the thicker the mist became, swirling around their ankles and making each step feel heavier, as if the forest itself were reluctant to let them in. It wasn't long before they noticed the silence. The usual sounds of the woods, chirping insects, rustling leaves, and the occasional owl had faded, replaced by an oppressive quiet. Every so often, they heard the faintest whisper, like a breeze carrying distant voices. But each time they stopped to listen, the voices disappeared. "Did you hear that?" Matt asked, stopping in his tracks. Lily nodded, her face illuminated in the flashlight's glow. "Yeah. It almost sounds like words. But it's probably just the wind." They pressed on, their playful chatter replaced by quiet tension. The path twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the forest until they came upon a small clearing. In the center stood an old stone well, moss-covered and cracked, as if it had been untouched for decades. The air around it felt colder, and a faint, strange smell hung in the air, damp earth mixed with something metallic. "Look at this," Lily whispered, stepping closer to the well. "It's like something out of a horror movie." Matt glanced at it uneasily. "You don't think maybe we should turn back?" Lily scoffed, flashing him a grin. "And miss out on the best part?" "Not a chance." She peered into the well, her flashlight illuminating only darkness below. The light seemed to vanish into an abyss, swallowed by the shadows. Suddenly, she gasped, pulling back. "I thought I saw something, a light or movement." Matt leaned in, trying to see what she'd noticed. But as he peered down, something strange happened. A faint glow appeared deep within the well, flickering like a candle flame, then vanishing. "Okay, that's weird," Matt said, stepping back quickly. "Maybe we should really go back." But before they could move, a low, whispering voice floated up from the well. The words were unclear, a strange language or perhaps just sounds too faint to understand, but the tone was unmistakably pleading. "Help us." The words sent a chill down both their spines. Lily froze, her heart pounding as she stared at the well. Did you hear that?" Matt nodded, his face pale. "It said help us." They backed away from the well, glancing around the clearing, suddenly feeling like they were being watched. The shadows seemed to press in, thickening and stretching, creating faces and shapes that weren't there moments before. Lily tried to steady her breath. Maybe it's just an echo, or something natural. But she didn't believe her own words, and neither did Matt. They turned to leave, but as they stepped toward the path, a gust of wind rushed through the clearing, sending leaves swirling around them. The whispers grew louder, filling the air, coming from every direction. The voice echoed once more, louder this time, carrying a sense of urgency. "Please, help, don't leave." Lily looked back at the well, feeling a strange pull, as if something was calling to her, reaching out from the darkness. She wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating presence, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was trapped here. "Lily, come on," Matt urged, grabbing her arm. "We need to go." Reluctantly, she nodded, and they turned to leave. But as they stepped back onto the path, the shadows seemed to shift, blocking their way. They tried to move forward, but the forest seemed to twist around them, the trees creating a maze that hadn't been there before. This wasn't here before," Matt said, panic creeping into his voice. Lily swallowed, glancing around. "I know, but let's stay calm. We'll find a way out." They turned, trying to retrace their steps, but the mist thickened, obscuring their view. Every direction looked the same, and the whispers grew louder, filling their ears, drowning out their thoughts. In the distance, a flickering light appeared, faint and distant. Lily's heart leapt. "Look! That could be the way out." They followed the light, their footsteps quickening. But the closer they got, the more distorted the light became, until it seemed to dance around them, moving from one place to another, leading them deeper into the forest. Suddenly, the light vanished, and they found themselves in a new clearing, empty and silent except for the ever-present whispering. A single figure stood at the center, shrouded in shadow, its form barely visible. It looked like a person, but something about it was wrong, its movements too fluid, its outline too distorted. The figure raised a hand, beckoning them forward. "Lily," Matt whispered, stepping back. "I think we need to go. Now." But Lily couldn't move. She felt transfixed, drawn to the figure by an inexplicable force. She took a step forward, her gaze locked on the shadowy form. The whispers grew louder, forming words that only she could hear, echoing in her mind. "Lily, please," Matt's voice was desperate, breaking through the fog that clouded her thoughts. She turned to him, her heart racing, realizing that they were in serious danger. Whatever was in Blackwood Forest was no legend, it was real, and it wanted something from them. They turned and ran, their footsteps pounding on the ground, not daring to look back. The whispers followed, growing louder, merging into a chorus of pleading voices. But they didn't stop, running faster and faster until they broke through the trees, stumbling out onto the road. The silence returned, the voices fading into nothing as they left the forest behind. Breathless and shaken, they looked back, the darkness of Blackwood Forest looming over them. But one thing was clear, they hadn't escaped its reach yet.
Part 2. Lily and Matt stood on the edge of Blackwood Forest, breathless and trembling. The haunting whispers still echoed in their minds, but the forest was quiet now, as if it had released them back into the world only temporarily. The air was cold, filled with a strange stillness that made their escape feel unreal. "We need to leave, like, now," Matt said, his voice breaking the silence. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the shadowy figure to emerge from the trees and follow them out. Lily nodded, still feeling the pull of the forest, as if something inside was reaching out, tugging at her thoughts. But she forced herself to turn away, trying to shake off the lingering fear. As they walked back toward town, they barely spoke, each haunted by what they'd experienced. Lily replayed the voice from the well in her mind, trying to make sense of the words. "Help us." Who was it asking for help? And why? The next day, Lily couldn't stop thinking about the forest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadowy figure, heard the whispers, and felt the chill of the air around the well. The feeling of being watched had followed her home, pressing down on her, gnawing at her thoughts. She knew returning to the forest would be dangerous, but the unanswered questions left her restless. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she texted Matt, "I think we need to go back." His response came quickly. "Asterisk, are you serious?" "Lily, we barely got out last time, asterisk." She hesitated, typing and deleting several replies before settling on asterisk, "But what if someone really needs our help? What if it's more than just a haunting, asterisk?" After a long pause, he replied, "Asterisk, fine. But if we go back, we're getting in and out fast. No more exploring, asterisk." They met again at the edge of Blackwood Forest, their flashlights in hand, the night thicker and darker than before. This time, the silence was even more oppressive, as if the forest itself was waiting for them. The air was colder, and the mist seemed to gather around them like a warning. They retraced their steps, following the narrow path toward the clearing with the well. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest were trying to hold them back, but they pressed on, pushing through the shadows. When they reached the clearing, the sight of the well filled them with a familiar dread. Lily approached it cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the rough stones covered in moss. The air around the well was frigid, and she could feel an unnatural energy pulsing from it, as if something inside were alive. "Lily, maybe this isn't such a good idea," Matt whispered, glancing nervously at the trees. But before she could respond, the faint light appeared in the depths of the well again, flickering and pulsing like a heartbeat. And then, as if in response to their presence, a low whisper floated up from the darkness. "Please, help." Lily shivered, feeling a pang of sympathy mixed with fear. "What are you? Why do you need help?" The voice was barely audible, a ghostly echo. "Trapped, so long, can't leave, set us free." Matt took a step back, his face pale. "Lily, I don't like this. What if it's trying to trick us?" But Lily's curiosity overpowered her fear. She leaned closer to the well, her voice steady. "How? How can we set you free?" The light in the well pulsed brighter, illuminating a series of strange symbols etched into the stones just below the surface. Lily reached down, tracing her fingers over the rough carvings, feeling an electric jolt shoot through her hand as she did. The symbols glowed faintly, their light pulsating in sync with the whispers. But as the symbols lit up, the air around them shifted. Shadows began to gather at the edges of the clearing, dark shapes moving through the trees. The whispers grew louder, turning into a chorus of voices, pleading, desperate, all blending into a haunting melody that surrounded them. "Lily!" Matt's voice was filled with panic as he grabbed her arm, pulling her back from the well. "This isn't right. We need to get out of here." But the moment they turned to leave, a figure stepped into the clearing, blocking their path. It was the same shadowy form they'd seen before, but this time it was clearer, more defined. Its eyes glowed with a faint, unsettling light, and its face, though indistinct, was filled with sorrow. "Please," the figure whispered, its voice echoing around them. "Set us free." Lily felt torn, fear battling with an overwhelming sense of pity. She wanted to help, to end whatever suffering this spirit was experiencing, but she knew she was venturing into something she didn't fully understand. "How?" she whispered, barely able to get the word out. The figure gestured toward the symbols on the well. "Touch them. Break the seal." Matt pulled her back, his voice firm. "Lily, don't. You don't know what could happen. This thing could be dangerous." But the figure's gaze was pleading, and Lily felt its sadness pressing down on her like a weight. "I have to try, Matt. If we don't help, what if it stays trapped here forever?" Ignoring his protests, she reached out and touched the symbols once more. The carvings grew brighter, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. The light pulsed, growing stronger, and the shadows around them seemed to shrink as though drawn toward the well. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and a gust of wind rushed through the clearing, swirling around them like a storm. The light from the symbols intensified, blinding them, and the figure began to dissolve, its form breaking apart as if finally released from a long-held prison. The voices faded, replaced by a deep, resonant silence that filled the air. The shadows receded, melting into the trees, and the oppressive feeling that had clung to the clearing lifted, leaving behind a sense of peace. Lily took a deep breath, feeling relief wash over her. I think we did it. They're free." But when she turned to look at Matt, her heart stopped. He stood still, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. His hand was clutching his chest, and he staggered back, gasping for breath. "Matt," she cried, reaching out to steady him. But before she could touch him, he fell to the ground, his eyes staring blankly at the sky, a faint smile on his lips. Lily's heart shattered as she knelt beside him, shaking him, trying to wake him. But he didn't move, his hand slipping from hers, his body growing still and cold. Tears blurred her vision as she realized the cost of their actions. She had freed the spirits, but in doing so, she had lost her closest friend.
Part 3. The world felt hollow as Lily knelt beside Matt, his lifeless face illuminated by her flashlight. Her mind struggled to process the reality of what had happened. They had come to Blackwood Forest to face an adventure, to explore the unknown together, but now she was alone, and her best friend was gone. The whispers had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to mock her grief. She felt a strange sense of betrayal, as though the spirits she tried to help had taken something from her in exchange. She didn't know what had happened to Matt or why he had collapsed, but she could feel that whatever they'd released from the well had exacted a toll. The trees around her cast long, menacing shadows, and she felt the weight of the forest pressing down on her. A faint breeze rustled through the leaves, but there was no comfort in it, only a reminder that she was alone. Taking a shaky breath, Lily forced herself to stand. She couldn't leave Matt here. She had to find help, get him back to town, but as she glanced around the clearing, she realized that the path they'd taken had disappeared. The trees loomed closer, the mist thickening, as if the forest itself were closing in on her. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, let me go." But the forest remained silent, indifferent to her pleas. She took a step forward, trying to retrace her steps, but each direction looked the same, dark, twisted, and filled with shadows that seemed to shift whenever she wasn't looking. Panic bubbled up inside her, and she felt a cold sweat trickle down her spine. Then, just as she was about to lose hope, a faint light appeared in the distance. It flickered like a flame, casting a warm glow through the mist. She didn't know if it was real or just another illusion, but she had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, she began to walk toward it, carrying Matt's weight as best she could, her steps slow and unsteady. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing a small cabin nestled among the trees. It looked old and worn, with ivy crawling up its sides and windows darkened by grime. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint warmth seeped out, as though the cabin were inviting her inside. With a mixture of fear and desperation, Lily pushed open the door and stepped into the cabin. Inside, a fire crackled in a stone fireplace, filling the room with a soft, comforting glow. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange artifacts, books, jars filled with herbs, and bundles of dried flowers. It looked like a place out of time, a relic of an older world. Lily gently laid Matt down near the fire, hoping the warmth would bring him back. She knelt beside him, her hand brushing his cheek, but his skin was cold, unyielding. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't leave me." As if in response, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Lily turned, her heart pounding, as a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was an elderly woman, her face lined with age, her eyes sharp and knowing. She wore a simple, faded cloak, and her gaze held a depth that made Lily feel as if she were looking into her very soul. "You're not meant to be here, child," the woman said, her voice soft but firm. "This forest has its secrets, and you have awakened them." Lily felt a surge of anger and grief. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to help. But now my friend, he..." The woman nodded, her expression filled with a quiet understanding. "You have been touched by the forest's curse. Once awakened, it takes what it is owed. But perhaps not all is lost." Lily's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope igniting within her. "Can you help him? Please, I'll do anything." The woman's gaze softened, and she nodded slowly. "There is a way, but it is not without cost." "I don't care," Lily replied, her voice firm. "I'll pay any price." The woman gestured for her to sit, and Lily obeyed, her heart racing. The woman took a bundle of herbs from the shelf and placed it on the fire, releasing a fragrant smoke that filled the room. She closed her eyes, murmuring in a language Lily didn't understand, her voice low and rhythmic. After a few moments, the woman opened her eyes, her expression grave. "The spirits demand a life, a presence to bind them to this place. To bring him back, you must offer something in return." Lily's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" The woman's eyes held a quiet sorrow. "If he is to return, he cannot leave this place. He will belong to the forest, just as the spirits do. You may see him again, but he will never be free. Lily felt a pang of despair. She wanted Matt back more than anything, but the thought of him being bound to the forest, trapped in its shadows, was almost too much to bear. She looked at his still form, the faint flicker of light on his face, and knew she had to make a choice. With a heavy heart, she nodded. I'll do it. I'll bring him back, even if it means he can't leave. The woman nodded, taking Lily's hand and guiding her to Matt's side. She murmured an incantation, her voice filling the room with a strange, otherworldly energy. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to gather around them as if the forest itself were watching. Then, slowly, Matt's eyes fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused at first, but as he looked at Lily, a faint smile touched his lips. Lily, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You came back. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged him, relief flooding over her. I'll always come back, Matt. I promise. But as she held him, she felt the weight of the woman's words pressing down on her. Matt was alive, but he was bound to the forest, a part of its eternal, haunting presence. She had saved him, but at a cost that would change their lives forever. Part 4. Lily held Matt tightly, feeling the warmth return to his skin as he slowly regained consciousness. Relief flooded through her, but the woman's words lingered in her mind. Matt was alive, but he was now bound to Blackwood Forest, his fate intertwined with the spirits they had disturbed. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, and a quiet dread gnawed at her heart. The old woman watched them silently, her eyes filled with a knowing sadness. She approached, resting a hand on Lily's shoulder. You have done a brave thing, the woman said softly. But be warned, the forest does not easily release what it claims. Matt's life is now tied to this place. If he ever tries to leave, the spirits will call him back. Lily looked at Matt, her heart breaking. She'd saved him, but he was now trapped. Isn't there any other way? Something that could truly set him free? The woman shook her head slowly. The spirits of Blackwood Forest demand balance. He was chosen. The only way he may leave this place is if he returns the life that was given back to him. Lily's eyes filled with tears. So, he's here forever? Matt, still weak but listening, took Lily's hand. I'd rather be here, alive, than wherever I was. As long as you're here, I can live with it. Lily managed a small, brave smile, though the fear in her heart remained. She knew she couldn't stay in the forest with Matt forever, but the thought of leaving him alone in the haunted woods felt impossible to bear. She turned to the woman, her mind racing with questions. Will he be safe here? Lily asked, her voice trembling. Or will the spirits come for him? The woman nodded. As long as he respects their boundaries, the spirits will let him be. They will watch, but they will not harm him unless he tries to break free. A silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Lily's heart ached, torn between the desire to keep Matt close and the harsh reality that he would never be able to leave. She knew she would have to go back to her life outside the forest, but she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him behind. After a long pause, Matt squeezed her hand, a small smile on his face. Lily, it's okay. I don't want you to give up your life for me. You can visit. And who knows, maybe I'll find a way to make this place feel a little less haunted. Lily laughed through her tears, touched by his bravery. She knew he was trying to make it easier for her, even though they both knew the depth of the sacrifice he was making. She looked into his eyes, determined. I'll come back, Matt. As often as I can, she promised. We'll find a way to make this work. The old woman handed Lily a small bundle of herbs tied with a black ribbon. Keep this close when you leave. It will protect you from the forest's shadows. And when you return, follow the scent of the herbs to find your way back. Lily took the bundle, clutching it tightly. She glanced at Matt, a bittersweet smile on her face. This isn't goodbye, okay? I'll be back. Matt nodded, his gaze steady. I know you will. With one last hug, she stood, feeling the weight of the forest pressing down on her as she turned to leave. She glanced back, watching Matt in the glow of the fire, his silhouette framed by shadows. She felt a pang of sorrow, but also a strange peace, knowing that he was alive and that she could return to him. As Lily walked through the forest, guided by the scent of the herbs, the trees seemed less menacing. The mist parted before her, as though the forest recognized her now, allowing her to pass unharmed. When she reached the edge of the woods, she looked back one last time, feeling the pull of Blackwood Forest and the part of her heart she'd left behind. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of normal life and longing. She told no one of what had happened, keeping her visits to the forest a secret. Every weekend, she returned to Blackwood, the bundle of herbs guiding her through the mist to Matt's cabin. Together, they talked, shared stories, and found comfort in each other's presence, each visit a small reminder of the bond that had survived even the shadows of Blackwood Forest. With time, the spirits grew accustomed to her visits, allowing her safe passage through the woods. Matt had settled into his strange new life, finding peace in the quiet of the forest, in the company of his closest friend. He planted flowers around the cabin, filling the clearing with color, turning the haunted woods into a place of beauty. Though bound to the forest, he had found a purpose, caring for the land, honoring the spirits, and keeping the balance that had been so delicately restored. And Lily, though free to leave, found herself more and more drawn to the forest, to the cabin in the clearing, and to the friend who had become her anchor in the midst of mystery and magic. They never fully understood the forest's magic or the reason for the whispers, but they had found something greater, a way to live within its shadows, to embrace the unknown, and to turn a place of fear into one of friendship and peace. And so, with each passing season, they built a life between the worlds, bound by loyalty, courage, and a love that defied even the oldest, darkest secrets of Blackwood Forest. Lily and Matt venture into Blackwood Forest, drawn by legends of strange lights and whispers. They're hoping for a thrill, but the forest holds more than shadows. As they venture deeper, they encounter eerie forces, testing their courage and the strength of their friendship. The Cursed Barn. Jake and Sarah had heard tales of the old barn for years. Located on the edge of town, hidden behind overgrown fields and twisted trees, the barn had a sinister reputation. Locals whispered of ghostly figures, strange noises, and shadows that moved on their own. Most people avoided the place, but Jake and Sarah, lifelong friends with a shared curiosity for the paranormal, were drawn to it. They decided to investigate, hoping to unravel the mystery for themselves. One cloudy evening, armed with flashlights and a bag of snacks, they set off toward the barn. Part 1. The old barn loomed ahead of Jake and Sarah, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. The structure was worn, its walls slanted with age, and thick vines snaked up its sides, giving it the look of something that had grown out of the earth and refused to let go. Rumors of strange figures and whispers haunted the place, making it the stuff of local legends. But Jake and Sarah, curious to a fault, saw the barn as a mystery waiting to be solved. They pushed open the rotting wooden gate that led to the barn, its hinges groaning as if it hadn't been moved in years. The air inside was thick and heavy, laced with the scent of damp wood and dust. They turned on their flashlights, the beams cutting through the dark as they made their way into the shadowed interior. The barn was empty, save for a few scattered tools and piles of hay that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Cobwebs draped over the beams above, and faint trails of moonlight filtered in through cracks in the walls, illuminating the dust that floated lazily in the air. It was silent, and every sound they made seemed amplified, echoing off the walls and making them both more aware just how alone they were. "I don't get what all the fuss is about," Jake said, shrugging. "It's just an old barn. Probably more dangerous than haunted." Sarah scanned the room, her expression skeptical. "Maybe. But why would people keep talking about it if there was nothing to it? And those stories about shadows moving, can you feel that? It's like the air in here is different." Jake chuckled, rolling his eyes. "Different? It's just musty. Probably filled with mold." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake a slight sense of unease, a prickling at the back of his neck. They moved deeper into the barn, their footsteps echoing. A faint draft blew through the structure, making the walls creak, and Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Then, just as she was about to say something, they both heard it, a soft whisper, almost too faint to be real, drifting through the air like a sigh. Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, stopping in her tracks. Jake paused, listening intently. But the whisper had faded, leaving only silence. He laughed nervously. "Probably just the wind. Old places like this always make weird noises." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She swept her flashlight over the walls, her gaze lingering on strange markings etched into the wood. They were faint, barely visible, but something about them sent a chill down her spine. The symbols looked like circles, twisted lines, and shapes that made no sense. "Jake, come look at this." Jake stepped closer, examining the marks. "Weird. Maybe kids messing around. Or farmers keeping track of something?" Sarah shook her head. "No, it's more like symbols, like some kind of ritual." He raised an eyebrow, smirking. "So what, you think this is a haunted barn and some cult used it to summon ghosts?" Sarah glared at him. "I'm just saying there's something strange about this place." They continued walking, but the feeling of unease grew, thickening the air until it felt like a weight pressing down on them. Then, as they reached the far corner of the barn, Jake's flashlight flickered and went out. He tapped it, frowning, but it stayed dark. Sarah's flashlight was still on, so she handed it to him. "Take mine. I've got spare batteries in my bag." As she rummaged through her bag, Jake swung the light around, illuminating a row of stalls on the other side of the barn. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow move between them, darting out of sight before he could focus on it. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice tense. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide. "See what?" "A shadow, moving over there," he said, pointing to the far stalls. She scanned the stalls, but saw nothing, only darkness beyond the reach of the flashlight beam. Maybe it was an animal. Old barns like this are probably filled with them. But even as she said it, her voice shook. Something about the barn felt wrong, as though they weren't alone. She slid the spare batteries into her flashlight, her hands trembling as she turned it back on. They took a few cautious steps toward the stalls, curiosity outweighing their fear. As they approached, the barn grew colder, and their breath came out in small clouds of mist, an odd sensation considering it was a mild autumn evening. The quiet was stifling, and they could feel something, an energy, a presence, that seemed to be watching, waiting. Just as they reached the first stall, a loud bang echoed through the barn, shattering the silence. They both jumped, turning their flashlights wildly around the room. The noise had come from the opposite end of the barn, near the entrance, but there was no one there, only the empty doorway and the shadows that seemed to stretch deeper with every second. "Okay, that wasn't just the wind," Jake said, his voice low. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. Maybe we should leave." But before they could turn around, another sound filled the barn, a low, rhythmic creaking, like the sound of someone swinging slowly back and forth. They shone their flashlights toward the center of the room, their beams catching on a chain hanging from the rafters. It swayed gently, as if recently disturbed, and a sense of dread filled them both. "Jake," Sarah whispered. "This place, it feels alive." He nodded, speechless for once, as the creaking grew louder, filling the barn. And then, out of the corner of their eyes, they saw it, a figure standing just inside the doorway, shrouded in shadow, watching them. Its outline was barely visible, more like a dark shape than a person, but its presence was unmistakable. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its gaze seemed to pin them in place, freezing them with a terror that was both primal and overwhelming. They could feel its hostility, its anger, as though they had trespassed somewhere forbidden. We have to go," Sarah whispered, barely able to force the words out. They backed away slowly, not daring to turn their backs on the figure, their flashlights trembling in their hands. The barn seemed to close in on them, the walls and shadows pressing closer, as if trying to trap them. But just as they reached the door, the figure vanished, and the air around them grew still. They glanced at each other, relief washing over them. Without a word, they turned and ran, leaving the barn and its chilling presence behind. But even as they reached the road, they could feel eyes watching them from the darkness, a reminder that whatever they had encountered in the barn wasn't finished with them yet. Part 2. Jake and Sarah hurried away from the barn, but the unsettling sense of being watched lingered, prickling at their nerves. Even back on the road, away from the barn's shadows, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. They exchanged a glance, both reluctant to speak of what they'd seen, as if giving it voice would somehow make it more real. The next morning, Jake texted Sarah. *, can we meet up? I can't stop thinking about what happened last night, *. Sarah replied immediately. *, let's meet at the park, *. They met under the old oak tree near the edge of the park, where kids often played and where they felt safer discussing their experience. Jake started, his voice low. I don't get it. That figure. It was like it wasn't real, but it felt like it was looking right at us. Sarah nodded, her face pale. I know. And the way it just disappeared. I mean, what was that? Maybe there's more to this barn than just rumors, Jake suggested, glancing around as if expecting the shadows from the barn to follow them here. Maybe someone, or something, never left. Sarah bit her lip, clearly uneasy. Are you saying we should go back? Jake hesitated, but his curiosity won out. I don't know, but I feel like we have to. We barely scratched the surface last night, and whatever's there, it wants us to know it's there. Sarah shivered, torn between fear and fascination. Fine. But if we go, we need to be prepared. Let's go during the day this time. Maybe it'll feel less. She paused, searching for the right word. Hostile. They returned to the barn that afternoon, hoping the daylight would make it feel less sinister. The fields around the barn were empty, quiet, as though the area had been abandoned for centuries. Even in the sunlight, the barn's weathered wood and the strange, looming shadows seemed to hold a darkness that defied explanation. Inside, the air was still, filled with the same damp, earthy scent they remembered. The beams of sunlight filtering through the gaps in the walls illuminated dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. It was almost peaceful, but they couldn't shake the memory of the figure from the night before. All right, Jake said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Let's look for anything that might explain what we saw. They split up, each moving cautiously through the barn, examining the walls, the floor, and anything that looked out of place. Sarah wandered to the back corner, where the strange markings they'd seen before were faintly visible in the light. She reached out to touch one, feeling the grooves carved into the wood. These symbols, they look almost like runes, Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Jake. But they're not any kind I recognize. Jake joined her, inspecting the carvings. Do you think they're connected to whatever we saw last night? Sarah nodded slowly. It's possible. I mean, people used to believe runes could bind spirits or create protections. What if these marks were meant to keep something trapped here? Jake swallowed hard, glancing around the barn. Or to keep something out. They continued their search, moving deeper into the shadows of the barn, their flashlights casting narrow beams that seemed to highlight just how empty and abandoned the place was. But then, in a dark corner near the far wall, Jake's flashlight caught on something metallic, a small, rusty door hidden behind a stack of decaying hay bales. Hey, Sarah, over here, he called, his excitement overcoming his nerves. Sarah hurried over, her eyes widening as she saw the door. I didn't even know there was a cellar here. Jake grabbed the handle, pulling with all his strength, but the door was heavy and resisted his efforts. After a few tries, it finally creaked open, releasing a rush of cold, stale air that carried the faint scent of decay. They both gagged, covering their noses, but the curiosity driving them was stronger than their disgust. They peered into the darkness, shining their flashlights down a narrow set of stone steps that led into the unknown depths beneath the barn. The light didn't reach the bottom, and the shadows seemed to pulse and shift, as if alive. Are we really doing this? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his face set with determination. We came this far. Let's just check it out, and then we'll leave. They began their descent, each step echoing in the tight, stone-lined space. The air grew colder as they went deeper, and the smell intensified, filling their senses with a sickly, rotting odor. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a low-ceilinged room with rough stone walls covered in faded symbols similar to those they'd seen upstairs. Sarah shone her flashlight around the room, her heart pounding as she took in the strange setup. In the center of the room was a large, circular stone slab, stained with something dark that had soaked into the stone. Around it were small objects, candles, melted down to stubs, and jars filled with murky liquid. It looked like some sort of ritual site, a place meant for offerings or sacrifices. Jake's face was pale as he pointed to the stone slab. What do you think happened here?" Sarah swallowed hard, her gaze locked on the strange markings on the slab. Maybe someone was trying to summon something. Or trap it here. Before either of them could say anything more, a faint whisper echoed through the room, sending chills down their spines. It was the same voice they'd heard in the barn the night before, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. "Leave, now!" They froze, glancing at each other, terror filling their eyes. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the walls themselves were speaking. The shadows around them grew darker, closing in, and they could feel a presence, a cold, angry force that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath them. Without a word, they turned and scrambled up the stairs, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they rushed to escape. The whispering grew louder, filling their ears, mingling with the sound of footsteps behind them. Jake was the first to reach the top, bursting out of the cellar and into the barn, with Sarah close behind. They slammed the door shut, hearts racing as they backed away, both panting and wide-eyed. But as they stood there, catching their breath, they realized the whispering had stopped. The barn was silent once more, its dark corners and looming shadows seeming almost peaceful. "Jake, we have to leave," Sarah gasped, her voice shaking. "There's something down there. Something angry." He nodded, not needing any convincing. Together, they rushed out of the barn, feeling the weight of whatever they disturbed pressing down on them even as they left the building behind. But as they crossed the field back toward the road, Sarah felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes watching them from the barn. They didn't stop until they were far down the road, leaving the barn behind in the fading light. The image of the ritual site and the dark slab haunted them, the whispers still echoing in their minds. They had uncovered part of the barn's mystery, but they were left with more questions than answers. Part 3. Back in the safety of town, Jake and Sarah tried to forget the dark cellar and the whispering voice. But no matter how hard they tried, the memory lingered, creeping into their thoughts at odd times. The feeling of dread followed them like a shadow, reminding them of what they had seen and disturbed in the barn. A few days later, Sarah received an unexpected call from an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Klein, who had heard about their visit to the barn through her grandson. Mrs. Klein was one of the few people in town who remembered the place's history, and she wanted to warn them. "People say it's just an old, abandoned barn, but they're wrong," Mrs. Klein said, her voice gravelly and cautious. "That place has a dark history. Years ago, a man lived there. He was a farmer, but people knew he practiced darker things. Strange rituals, sacrifices, things you wouldn't believe. He claimed he could commune with spirits." Sarah's heart pounded. "What happened to him?" Mrs. Klein sighed, her voice a whisper. "They say he went mad, talking about shadows and voices only he could hear. One night, he vanished. Some believe he succeeded in trapping a spirit, or something worse, in that barn." After thanking Mrs. Klein, Sarah quickly called Jake, recounting the conversation. He was silent for a moment before responding. "So, we went poking around a barn with some kind of trapped spirit, or worse, something it couldn't contain?" he asked, his voice a mix of fear and irritation. "Pretty much," Sarah replied, feeling a chill. "It sounds like whatever he tried to summon or contain is still there. And I think we woke it up." Jake sighed. "We can't just leave it like this. If there's a chance something's trapped, and it's dangerous, we need to make sure it doesn't get out." Though terrified, Sarah agreed. They decided to return to the barn, this time better prepared. Jake suggested bringing salt, an old trick he heard could protect against spirits, and Sarah gathered candles and a few herbs that were said to calm restless spirits. They weren't sure if it would work, but it was better than going in empty-handed. They met in the early afternoon, hoping the daylight would give them some protection. The barn loomed ahead, its familiar, eerie presence filling them with dread. But this time, they felt a strange determination. They were going to confront whatever was there and, hopefully, put it to rest. Inside, the barn was as quiet and still as ever, but they could sense a change in the air, as though the shadows were denser, darker. They approached the cellar door cautiously, feeling the weight of whatever lurked below. "Ready?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, clutching her bag of supplies. They opened the door and descended the stairs, each step echoing through the tight, cold space. When they reached the bottom, the sight of the dark stone slab sent a shiver down their spines, but they forced themselves forward. This time, they arranged the salt in a circle around the slab, placing the candles at intervals and lighting them. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the walls, illuminating the strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural light. Sarah sprinkled the herbs around, muttering a quiet prayer for protection. "If there's any spirit here," she said, her voice strong, "we ask for peace. We're here to help." For a moment, there was only silence. But then, a faint, cold breeze swept through the room, and the shadows around them began to shift, swirling around the stone slab as though alive. The whispering returned, growing louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, pleading, angry, desperate. Jake's face was pale as he poured more salt around them. "Sarah, I don't think they're listening." The whispering grew louder, almost drowning them out. The shadows coalesced into a figure above the slab, a dark, writhing shape with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, as though it were screaming silently. It reached toward them, its form stretching, its voice a chorus of pain and rage. "Leave us be," the voices hissed, merging into a single, chilling command. Sarah's courage faltered, but she held her ground. "Please, we just want to help. Tell us what you need." The figure paused, its empty gaze fixed on her. For a moment, the shadows shifted, as if uncertain. Then, slowly, it pointed to the stone slab, and Sarah realized the truth. This wasn't just a ritual site. It was a prison, a place where something had been bound, held by the symbols carved into the walls in stone. "We have to break the seal," Sarah whispered, glancing at Jake. "That's what's keeping them trapped." Jake looked doubtful. "And what if breaking it makes things worse?" But Sarah shook her head. "If we leave them like this, they'll never stop. Whatever happened here, they need to be set free." Taking a deep breath, she reached out, tracing her fingers over the symbols etched into the slab. The stone felt cold and rough beneath her touch, and as she moved her fingers, the symbols began to fade, their light dimming. The shadows around them shifted, growing quieter, as though watching, waiting. Jake stepped back, his face tense. "Sarah, be careful." But before she could respond, the air around them exploded in a burst of icy wind, and the figure above the slab dissolved into a mist that filled the room, swirling around them. The whispering faded, replaced by a deep, resounding silence that felt both peaceful and final. The shadows in the room began to lift, retreating into the corners as the oppressive energy dissipated. They stood in stunned silence, feeling the weight that had hung over the barn finally release. "I think we did it," Sarah whispered, a sense of relief washing over her. Jake nodded, though his face was pale. "I think you're right. Whatever was trapped here, it's gone now." They carefully extinguished the candles, gathering their things as they made their way back up the stairs. The air in the barn felt lighter, clearer, as though the darkness that had haunted it for years had finally been lifted. For the first time, the barn felt empty, just an old, abandoned building with no secrets left to hide. As they walked back to the road, they exchanged a glance, a quiet understanding passing between them. They had faced something unknown, something dangerous, but together they had found the strength to put it to rest. And though they would never fully understand the mysteries of the barn, they knew one thing for certain: whatever had once haunted the old building had finally found peace. Part 4. In the days after their final encounter at the barn, Jake and Sarah felt a strange sense of closure. The feeling of being watched had vanished, and even though they occasionally thought about the figure they'd seen in the shadows, it no longer felt threatening. They had faced the unknown, and in some inexplicable way, they had laid it to rest. As they returned to their normal routines, word spread quietly around town about their experience. Mrs. Klein, the elderly neighbor who had told them about the barn's dark history, was one of the first to hear the full story. She called Sarah the day after they visited the barn, her voice tinged with both relief and curiosity. "You did a brave thing," she said. "I don't think anyone else would have had the courage to face it. But I wonder, what exactly did you see?" Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to describe it. "It was like a shadow, a figure that didn't feel like it belonged in this world. It felt angry and sad, almost like it had been stuck there, waiting for someone to set it free." Mrs. Klein was silent for a moment before she spoke again. "The old farmer who used to own that barn, the one who practiced those rituals. I think he left more behind than just the stories. Perhaps he bound more than just spirits there, perhaps he left a part of himself, too." Chilled by Mrs. Klein's words, Sarah thanked her and hung up, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she and Jake had done something important, something that would protect the town from whatever the farmer had stirred up all those years ago. That weekend, they met up and decided to visit the barn one last time in daylight, hoping to find it as empty and ordinary as it had seemed before all the strange occurrences. They arrived in the early afternoon, the sun shining down on the weathered wood and overgrown grass surrounding the barn. To their relief, it looked just like an old, abandoned building, no shadows lurking in the corners or strange whispers in the air. They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing softly in the quiet barn. It felt like a different place now, empty and still. The cellar door was shut, and when they pulled it open, they found nothing but a dusty staircase leading down to the bare stone floor. The strange symbols on the walls had faded, and the heavy atmosphere that had once filled the space was gone. "It's like it was never even here," Jake said, letting out a relieved sigh. "No shadows, no voices. Just silence." Sarah nodded, smiling. "Maybe we really did help them find peace. The place finally feels like it's just an empty barn." They explored the rest of the barn, taking in the silence and the feeling of calm that had settled over the place. It was just an old building now, stripped of its mysteries, and they both felt a sense of pride in having faced something so unknown, so eerie, and come out of it stronger. As they left the barn and walked back toward the road, Sarah looked back one last time. The barn stood quiet, framed against the clear sky, the door slightly ajar as if inviting anyone who dared to step inside. But she knew there was nothing left to fear. The spirits, whatever they had been, were gone. In the weeks that followed, life settled back into its usual routine. Jake and Sarah returned to school, caught up with friends, and shared knowing glances whenever they heard someone mention the old barn. They knew that, for them, it would always be a place where they had faced their deepest fears and discovered the strength that lay within. One evening, as they sat on Sarah's porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jake spoke up, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You know, we could probably start a business, paranormal investigators of small town or something," he joked, nudging her with his elbow. "We're practically experts now." Sarah laughed, rolling her eyes. "Sure, because everyone's lining up to see haunted barns and creepy cellars." He shrugged, grinning. "Hey, you never know. But seriously, thanks for sticking with me through it. I wouldn't have wanted to face that, whatever it was, with anyone else." Sarah smiled, her heart warming. "Same here. I think we make a pretty good team." They sat in comfortable silence as the last rays of sunlight faded, leaving the sky a soft, dusky blue. They knew they'd carry the memories of the barn with them for a long time, but they also knew that, whatever darkness they had faced, they'd faced it together. And that, somehow, made all the difference. After that, they found a new appreciation for the ordinary, late-night walks, quiet afternoons at the park, and weekend hangouts that didn't involve exploring haunted places. But they both knew that, if they ever stumbled across another mystery, another unexplained shadow, they'd be ready to face it. Together. And as for the old barn, it returned to its quiet existence on the edge of town, slowly falling apart, just another forgotten structure. No one ever reported strange shadows or whispers there again, and in time, the stories about it faded into nothing more than rumors. But sometimes, on certain nights when the air was still, Jake and Sarah would talk about their adventure and remember the shadowy figure, the cold cellar, and the strange symbols that had been etched into the walls. They would share a quiet smile, knowing they had once walked into the unknown and returned with a story only they would ever truly understand. And somewhere, perhaps, in a way they couldn't explain, they knew the spirits they had encountered were finally at rest, their whispers silenced, leaving only the echo of peace in their wake. Part 5. Months had passed since Jake and Sarah's encounter at the old barn, and though life returned to normal, the memory lingered, tucked into quiet moments they shared, a bond formed through the strange and terrifying experience. They rarely spoke about it openly, but on cool autumn evenings or misty mornings, a knowing glance between them was enough to recall the fear, the bravery, and ultimately, the peace they had found in that haunted place. One evening, as Halloween approached, they found themselves in the cozy warmth of Sarah's living room, watching horror movies and munching on popcorn. It had become a tradition for them, one born from their real-life brush with the supernatural. They laughed at the over-the-top special effects, both of them silently comparing the fictional scares to the real shadows and whispers they had once encountered. "I wonder," Jake said thoughtfully, pausing the movie, "do you think anyone else will ever go to that barn and find what we found?" Sarah considered it, a smile playing on her lips. "I hope not. It felt like whatever was there finally went away. I think we were meant to be the last ones to see it." He nodded. "But it still makes me wonder how many other places are out there holding on to stories like that, just waiting for someone to stumble upon them." Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "Let's leave those to someone else. I think we've had our fill of haunted barns and creepy symbols." Jake grinned, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, no more haunted barns. But if we ever do find another mystery, you know you'll want to solve it." She smirked, nodding in agreement. "Maybe. But only if we're in it together." They shared a comfortable silence, both of them warmed by the unspoken understanding that whatever adventures lay ahead, they would face them side by side. As they watched the final scene of their movie, a gentle knock came at the door. Sarah went to answer, surprised to find Mrs. Klein, their elderly neighbor who had first told them about the barn's strange history, standing on the porch with a smile and a tin of cookies in her hands. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said warmly. "I thought I'd bring you two a little something for Halloween." Sarah welcomed her in, and they all sat together, sipping tea as Mrs. Klein reminisced about her own childhood in the town. She spoke of legends, strange happenings, and the secrets held by abandoned places just waiting to be rediscovered. Her tales brought a sparkle to her eyes, and Jake and Sarah listened with rapt attention, feeling as though they were peeking into a world of stories that stretched far beyond their own experience. When she finished her tea, Mrs. Klein leaned in, her expression serious. "You know, not everyone would have been brave enough to face what you did. It takes a special kind of courage to walk into the unknown, and even more to walk away with respect for what you've seen." Jake and Sarah glanced at each other, a quiet pride filling their hearts. They hadn't sought recognition, but hearing Mrs. Klein's words made their experience feel even more meaningful. As Mrs. Klein prepared to leave, she turned back to them one last time, her eyes twinkling with a mischievous glint. "And remember, sometimes, the things that seem scary are just old memories needing a place to rest. You two made sure of that." With a final smile, she left, her words hanging in the air like a gentle reminder of the legacy they had touched. Jake and Sarah sat in silence, each reflecting on her words, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over them. They had not only faced something dark and unknown, but had, in a small way, become part of the history of the place. They knew that the barn would fade from memory, its stories slowly forgotten, yet their experience would live on within them, a reminder of bravery, friendship, and the quiet magic of setting old spirits free. They looked at each other and smiled, knowing that whatever else came their way, they would carry that strength with them, bound by a friendship that had walked the edge of fear and emerged stronger.